Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another in Rallyware's ongoing webinar series. Today, we're going to focus on digital strategy for direct selling companies, specifically how to use that technology to drive KPIs. And today, I am excited to have with us Paul Jones. Paul is CEO at Commerce Operators, and you can see by his portfolio of past companies that he has experience both inside of and outside of the direct sales channel. So that means he understands the nuances and idiosyncrasies of direct selling, but I can guarantee you he's able to give us some insights from outside the channel that are going to prove very valuable to us today. Paul, thanks so much for being with us.
Appreciate it, Rich. It's been great chatting with you over the last couple of weeks getting ready for this.
Yes, it has. So I'm excited for this. Before we begin, let me share a few logistics for today. We are recording the session, and all of you will receive a link to that recording. But after my conversation today with Paul, we are going to be addressing any specific questions that you might have. So please, as we are going through this session today, as you think of them, enter them within the Q&A, and we will address those at the end. So let me start by giving us a little context or backdrop, if you will. So both inside of and outside of direct selling. So direct selling in 2021, supposedly a year of growth overall. But as we look at that growth, it does present us with some questions about what is that post-pandemic future of the industry, right? So according to DSA, direct selling revenue was up. And as we took a closer look with Rallyware customers, so at the start of 2022, Rallyware's analytics experts extracted and ran numbers on an aggregated and anonymized customer data that they received. And we saw some interesting things, right? So here we saw 14% increase in new user adoption over 2020. We saw a lot of users come in 2020. We saw, yes, new users come in 2021. But what those users did in 2021, it seems like they were generally more active and committed in 2021 than they were in 2020. So by what they did in the tasks and activities and what they focused on in L&D, it looked like, and I'm going to make the assumption that the more effort they put into some of that work, the more and better results they got out of their businesses. So the other piece of the puzzle that I want to address before we get in this conversation is really the gigification, if that's a word, of direct selling, right? And any of you who know John Fleming or have not been made aware of the ultimate gig, you should take a look at that, not only from outside the industry and gig economy and its effect across the world, but really today, how that is going to affect us as direct sellers. So here you see some of John's stats or tidbits of information about people engaged in multiple gigs, right? And I think that number is like 66 or 67%. The number of individuals calling themselves direct selling distributors. So I really think, and that we're going to talk about a little bit today, that we got to view ourselves as alternatives to that, right? We are a gig opportunity. And then you saw from Paul's pedigree, some of the things he's going to bring to us today come from that retail space. So we're starting to see a number of retailers supplementing what they're doing inside that brick and mortar with that direct selling model. So the conclusion we are drawing is, neither direct selling or retail is going to remain the same. And really, that's where our conversation with Paul is going to begin today. So how does digital strategy support the changes that I was just talking about? So Paul, let's get started. They're tired of listening to me talk. So according to the latest jobs data, hiring slowed last month in August for the second month in a row. You and I, with our experience in direct selling, know that adage, right, that we use in direct selling, that when the economy goes south, direct selling improves. What do you think that means as an implication for the technology, especially talking about how we're competing with the gigs now? What does that mean for the technology in the direct selling space? What do we have to think about, if you will?
Well, I think that the first thing to back up on that as well is that the pattern that a lot of direct sellers have relied on has changed. And so, yes, direct selling is a cyclical business, and you'll see the ebbs and flows. What I think has been very nuanced in this, and where we're seeing like a pretty big change as well, is that the people that then come into direct selling are more and more looking for that immediate payment in the form of, we had started looking at it before as gratification. To be honest with you, with the gig competitors, it's turning into like immediate rewards and payment. And so I think that when that growth, where people were looking at it and relying on it, where the economy downturns and then it grows, it's tied back to they're competing against others in a space that right now are much more established and set up for that immediate reward gratification side of things. So that's where it's sort of slowing a little more slow that we're seeing. And so then when that supports the technology, it's imperative to make sure that that we're in a direct selling industry able to then be able to support that, whether it's in commerce, whether it's in other forms.
So I agree with that wholeheartedly, right? So if we're going to challenge the gigs, one of the attractions of those alternatives out there is just what you talked about, that immediate gratification, that as soon as I make a sale, as soon as I have a show, I see payment, right? So it's that type of thing. One of the other things that I'm going to ask you about, and this maybe doesn't have to do necessarily with technology, but so let's say I want to drive for Uber the next 2 months to make some extra money for holiday gifts, right? And then I don't want to do anything until that same time period rolls around next year. It's that easy ability to jump in and jump out. So what do you think about that?
It's such a complicated problem for direct sellers to solve.
Yes.
When you look at, and I'll sort of categorize it in the back office side of the way that the business runs. It's just very challenging to set up and organize a way that you can effectively pause people's activity. From a marketing perspective, it was always, my role to challenge the persona that you actually saw, and to actually recognize the fact that that persona needs to change all the time. It could be that the whatever you call them, consultant, advocate, etc., could be anything from a basic seller, or even just a consumer, all the way through that ecosystem. And having a technology infrastructure in place that can recognize that is adamant to that success, because you then can communicate to that customer the way that you currently can do inside the direct-to-consumer space. And the business logic in direct selling just needs to adapt to be able to do that. It's just, you don't, and you're going to have bigger problems.
Okay. We talked about easy to sign up, easy to come and go, get my pay immediately. Some of us in direct selling still put what I'll call a major hurdle, right, to me coming into the business. Because I've got to buy something for $190. I have to $99 kit, whatever that is. So what about technology that can help? So to me, that's the three sort of legs of this stool, right? What technology can help us overcome that hurdle?
Well, if the price point's high, then now there are alternative payment vendors that can assist in that process. But you really, as a direct seller, have to be aligned to that type of business model because of the fact that, so using those examples, Afterpay would be one of them. But like really what it comes down to is, the initial point of purchase is broken into micropayments so that the ability for you to be able to then get started makes it a little bit less of a personal financial risk for you to start. And I think it's quite interesting because you could rewind that back numerous years to before that technology was even in place. Some credit card vendors in different geographies would have broken that up and ran it that way too. So I think it's really just helping that barrier to entry. But in addition to that, it's much more behind the scenes. Some of the big direct sellers also recognize that it's not just about getting people into the organization, it's about nurturing them through success. And honestly, that's where I've seen Rallyware as a product among a few others to be very good at taking the customer through the process of here are the critical things you need to do to be successful. Because it's not about just bringing people in. You can't just churn and burn through people because eventually you'll run out of people.
So just totally transparent to our listeners out there today, that was not a paid commercial announcement. Paul actually has worked for a number of direct selling companies that utilize Rallyware, so he speaks from a bit of experience. So Paul, let's take ourselves away from the individual coming on, how we can improve that process and compete against the gigs. Let's put on your corporate hat now, indirect selling, and you hear, whether it's indirect selling or outside of direct selling, everybody's talking about digital transformation, right? So think of your direct selling experience. How did you come to see the necessity of digital transformation in direct selling?
Well, I think that the term is becoming a little overused.
I would agree.
But I do believe in the early, I would say early days of when that started. So I would probably rewind 5, 6, 7 years. It was really needed. And I think that the statement I would make there is that big legacy organizations, and even some now I'd recognize these patterns in smaller ones, created a pretty big problem for themselves where they, as the technologies that were available were very young, leveraged and custom built everything themselves. And so, and what's quite interesting is when I worked at a big organization, you sort of saw that and you recognized the need and you had the financial wherewithal to be able to say, this is going to be an enormous opportunity to then move to a buy versus build scenario and balance it out. And then the challenges around doing that were then figuring out your capital investment and and then switching to OpEx because, it's a completely different way to financially record all of this. And that's a bigger challenge. But irrespective of it all, it really just kind of comes down to the fact that now things have changed so dramatically that you couldn't possibly keep up with the innovation that a large technology company that specializes in whatever that solution would be yourself. It's just impossible. The human investment behind doing that and then the risk involved, it's just not possible anymore. But I think that it switches the paradigm completely, which is that you've then got to change your team, your internal team, to be curious and researchers and strategists that look at the ecosystem and constantly challenge things and change the way that the organization's operating. And that's a challenging thing to do in a big company, and actually even a small company, because in a smaller organization, which I've basically been involved in for the last few years now, working with smaller direct sellers, they want to take this challenge on too, and they don't have the resources necessary. So then they're relying on consultants like myself to actually guide them through the process.
So let me ask you, I'm going to drill down to that specific example, right, of that buy versus build mentality, not becoming an IT shop today. So a lot of what we're seeing with direct sellers across the large and small, right, they're not happy with their e-commerce platform. And I know, that's sort of your claim to fame here in your company. So we're doing a commercial for you right now, but let's talk about it. Everybody's going, I want to use Shopify. I want to use WooCommerce. Tell us what we should be considering as a company when we start making those statements.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, anyone that's on this call or that's working in a strategy role at a direct seller is gonna know this statement. So I'm not gonna belabor on it too much, but there really is a huge need in the direct selling industry to move more to a commerce environment that's cost effective, and that commerce environment produces products that are scalable and easy to manage, both from a internal customer perspective. So that could be in your L&D department or your marketing department, but just not for it to have such a heavy tech footprint. In the past, virtually every request that came in from the marketing department had to be put into an IT sprint, and then you had to wait for that to happen. What I've seen in the last 2 years has been that even the biggest technology providers, the Salesforces of the world, are moving to this state of composable commerce, which is where Shopify basically at this point has really sort of pushed everyone to that basically enables these app capabilities in anything from ratings and reviews or payment integrations to just be something as simple as you download effectively the plugin for the overall environment, you install it, and you're up and running. So there's a little bit of testing and QA that needs to be done, but it pales in comparison to the work that a few years ago you had to do. And so it rapidly accelerates the pace of innovation for an organization, and allows them to be able to try and test new things and new technologies and capabilities.
So let me play devil's advocate. So I've heard people throwing stones at that concept because the Shopifys of the world can't handle the nuances, the idiosyncrasies, the promotions, the incentives that direct selling wants to be able to leverage in their business space.
Mm-hmm. I'll laugh at that statement. It's
good.
It's actually, yeah. I will challenge it with anyone, and I would basically say that was something that my colleagues would always say was impossible, and so I took on that challenge, and with probably one of the best Shopify partners in the marketplace, figured it out. So at the end of the day, it's a simple thing, which is that if you're a direct seller and you have significant volume that is coming through your commerce environment, then Shopify is probably not the right solution for you. A larger solution like Salesforce or hybris likely still is, but it's not. It's got nothing to do with the let's just say the bandwidth and the transactions that are going through the system. It's more to do with the fact that Shopify as a platform can't be customized. That's a very important point. You cannot customize the platform. If you and it's the reason why they're as successful as they are. If your requirements require that customization, then you need to introduce middleware to accomplish it. And so then that's where that starts to break. The more complicated it becomes. The Salesforce, as an example, ecosystem is a little more flexible to accommodate for that, as is Hybris. So at that point, it really just gets to, depending on who you are as a size of an organization, and depending on how precise you need your business requirements to be as they pertain to the direct selling model, that then automatically makes the choice of the technology. It's basically about the process, not about the technology.
For those of you out there listening today, that was a nugget you should hang on to about the platform not being able to be customized and what your solution is following up on that. Thank you for that, Paul. Mm-hmm. Hey, so let's step back from commerce right now. Let's talk about what are some needs in digital strategy for direct selling that you are not currently seeing addressed?
I think that there's two that I would point out, and then I'd love for us to discuss them in a little more detail. The first one is just simplifying back office tools. We can dig into that because I think it's a big statement. And then the last one's just data. And when things are right, and when you've basically got that in place, then the all-powerful ability to have predictive analytics in place. But that does not work until the data foundation is solid.
So in what ways would you say direct selling companies, from what you've seen, and the nice thing is I know you've worked within direct selling companies, and in your new role, you have worked with multiple direct selling companies, so it gives you a nice perspective across the industry. How are we flying blind right now, us as direct sellers, direct selling companies?
Well, I think that what it comes down to is data, right? The ability for the organization to be able to react rapidly to changing market conditions. And I think that at this point, a lot of that is caused by technology limitations. So what I've observed, and it just varies enormously depending on the company, is that if they rely at this point, let's just say they're a small direct seller, they're relying on the data flowing from back office tools. And the problem with that is that some of those back office tools are a little archaic in the way that they're currently managing the business. So then the data that's coming out of it isn't able to look at the level of granularity that you would want to see when you start introducing unstructured data into the equation. It's not just about, it's not as binary anymore. It's not, did this transaction occur here that resulted in, this customer? And we talked earlier about, what persona that person has. So all of a sudden, you really do have to start looking at a back office environment that has that future vision, and they have actually started to improve how they're then being interfaced with these modern commerce platforms. Because right now it's an apple and an orange; they're two different things. The bigger organizations recognize that early. The reality when we sort of rewind back to at the time where I was working in those organizations. That's where you start to look at it and be a little more proactive in it. And you have to build, and I'm using buzzwords, but you basically have to build a data lake. And you have to then, once you've got that data foundation in place, be able to then cleanse that data, because in that lake, it's meaningless unless you've actually got a way to translate that information appropriately. And then it then feeds into the systems that then produce the predictive analytics and actions. But architecturally, it's a very complicated thing to do, and requires, for most organizations at this point, still a fairly large investment. So it's not something that a small direct seller could jump into right now at this point. The technology and the investment behind it is fairly high.
So relatedly, for organizations who are just starting to digitalize, I'll call it now, what are some of the things we want to stay away from? What are some of the mistakes we want to avoid that you have seen companies stumble into in your experience?
So the first one is around RFPs, and working to make sure that they're done appropriately. Again, I'm speaking to a broad audience here. You know, like when you're a big company, you've got a disciplined process there, and then you have procurement help to go through that. If you're a small direct seller, you've got to rely on someone to help you there, and you can't just take one company and assume that that company is going to just be able to help you with the things you're looking for. You've got to put the discipline behind getting a minimum of 3 bids and understanding exactly what the strengths and weaknesses are. So you build a scorecard, and that scorecard and criteria really help you make that decision. So I would highly recommend, when you go through that you have a neutral third party that assists you in that process, that you might make the right decision. Otherwise, you're going to be backed into a corner on a bad decision that you'll find in a few years will be very difficult to unwind from. The second point is really an important one too, which is that when you bring on a new technology vendor, or frankly, even a new consultant or company, take the time, even though it's a very difficult thing to do from a patient's perspective, to onboard them appropriately so that they can really understand the differences in direct selling. Time and time again, I saw us bring on new vendors and expected them to just understand things immediately. I mean, I can speak from firsthand experience of that. When I moved from the retail environment to direct selling, it took more than a year and a half to truly understand the differences, and great ideas that I thought at the time were that were going to be game changers were just horrible ideas. You know, and it wasn't until later that you realized why. And so it's a very, very important point to make sure, because it's hard to pinpoint the differences in direct selling, but to have it well articulated ahead of time is a big deal. And then the third thing is to make sure to include a tech provider in your architecture design, not just the solution implementer. So what I mean by that is, no matter what, like if you hire a company and they're an agency, I'm talking small now, right? To build your solution, you're going to need to make sure that the solution provider, the technology provider, so in this small instance, it might be Shopify, is literally part of that constant ongoing transformation. And then on a large side of things, it could be an example of, like, you selected Salesforce or Hybris or SAP as like the vendor. You can want them to have skin in the game too, not just to hire a solution implementer, the various different ones out there, and just rely on them to get it done too. Like, it's the fox watching the hen house. And so at the end of the day, that's good tips that I would provide to anybody looking to take this kind of stuff on.
I really like all three of those, but even that second one that you talked about, onboarding these vendors who, might not be familiar with direct selling. I would say even those vendors who are in the industry, that onboarding, that including them in, as you said, design, but even before that, what's the objective and the strategy behind why you brought them,
Yeah.
to the party? Because that, I'll tell you, we were just, working with one of those providers that exists in the industry the other day to partner with them, and to get their head wrapped around what the client wanted to accomplish took a while.
Yeah, like I'll build on it a tiny bit too, and use an example. So I'm working right now with a medium-sized direct seller, and they're shifting their strategy so that their mix is going to be a little more weight towards direct to consumer. But they still have to know the nuances of direct selling, otherwise it's going to be problematic in the long run. And so where it got very complicated was that the best practice in that specific environment and ecosystem was going to be to use a direct-to-consumer loyalty provider in the Shopify ecosystem. But the problem with that is that then you then have to take a step back and look at, by doing that, how do you make the necessary business decisions internally to be able to keep that loyalty program flowing the way it's intended and designed, but still to follow the requirements that you get from direct selling. And that really does take a lot of thought. And so the point there is that you can't just go blindly into it. You've got to have people within your own company that are very familiar with and curious around how that could work. Otherwise, you'll end up at the end of the day creating the same program you had, and that's not a good thing either.
That is correct. So that last question, if we remember, was about what pitfalls to avoid, right? So what are some of the best examples of digitalization that you've seen in a company, specifically direct selling? Best, worst, but no need to name names, please don't.
Yeah. No, I won't. But I will point out that the example that I'm going to use first was not only a game changer in my career, but also allowed me to establish relationships with the software provider that now have been extremely beneficial moving forwards. So the example I'm going to use here is basically that when you go through a global enterprise digital transformation, not all the time the software partner that you're working with fully knows the scope of what it is that you're trying to accomplish. Back to the know the nuances of direct selling statement. And so the best example I can provide is where that we went through that process, and it really wasn't until we were very close to signing the final deal that a realization came that the SKUs that the software provider had didn't even meet our needs. We had to literally persuade them to create new SKUs to sell to our industry, because of the fact that our industry requires unlimited software licenses. Now, most software providers will be very scared to provide you unlimited licenses. And arguably, you're not really asking for unlimited licenses. What you're asking for is the ability to be able to switch on or off, depending on that person's activity state, that license. And so I think that was really the biggest hurdle, because a lot of software as a service providers aren't set up that way. They're set up to charge per user. They're set up to charge per transaction, because that's how typically they work in the consumer world. That was a good example. And to that point, building that relationship with the pre-sales and sales teams in those vendors basically then set up those relationships. Now, years after the fact, now I'm still close with some of the people I worked with, and we joke around about the fact that I beat them up as hard as we did to basically get where we needed to be. But that, ironically for them, that then created those SKUs that then grew their business. So it was uncomfortable to go there in the beginning, but got them to recognize that it was the right vertical as well.
See, we came back around to that coming and going within the business, right?
Yeah. And then the worst example, I put a lot of thought into this one because I think that it's no different than if you were in an interview question, and someone says to you, what's the worst example? You look at it and go, well, I don't know whether I want to share that. But you see, to be very, so for me specifically, I reflected on it and decided I've got an example that I'll use, and it's really a flaw that I still believe is in myself, and it's really that I should sometimes give up on things when I know that everything in my head is telling me that I need to stop. And so the example that I'll use is that a few years ago, people that do a lot of social advertising are going to recognize that there was a fundamental shift in data and data privacy that meant that for a little while, brands that were advertising saw significant decline in the attribution and sales that they were basically seeing on platforms like Facebook and others. And it was because Apple made a significant update to their security, and it blocked a lot of traffic. And then a number of other providers shortly followed suit. Why that's important to explain is that a year prior to that, I was in charge of a program that was responsible for taking a concept of creating a GeoNet of advertising in different regions that would allow for us to see full attribution of sales to a sales consultant, advocate, whatever we want to call it. So corporate would do the advertising on social media, but the attribution of the sale was precise, and we knew that lead was given to the consultant, and it was working amazingly well. Literally, if anyone's in marketing or familiar with this term, the ROAS that we were receiving from that was higher than 6 or 7, which is just unbelievably good. Then all of a sudden fell off the map because of these changes. And we were in denial around why, and kept trying and replanning. And in the end, it just sadly had to be stopped. And to this day, I'm still not really sure that it could be resumed. I think it's one of those things that was you used to be able to do this statement. I don't think you can do it anymore.
And we both know, having been in technology, there are a number of those things that were gold mines for a while, and then either the platform itself, like the Facebook, turned them off, or they changed it and they adopted that as their strategy, right? So
yeah, I mean, and the warning sign all along was that there are some direct sellers that literally saw massive accelerated growth because of platforms like Facebook, and now they're struggling with it. So that should have probably been the warning sign ahead of time to say maybe that was not the right plan.
Thank you, Paul, so much for answering my questions that I posed to you. And everybody out there today, We've talked a lot about digital strategy, digitalization, which is hard for me to say. But if you remember, the title of what we are here for is actually and specifically how to use that to drive KPIs, metrics, to actually affect the business. So just to clarify, we're not talking technology for technology's sake here. So we are talking about putting changes into place into your organization to actually affect the business. So to that point, we have seen across not only Rallyware customers, but across the industries, companies who embrace digital transformation saw more gains in the field, okay? Hands down. The most successful companies performed more like gig economy platforms than ever. So those are the two things that I'm going to leave you with on why we're talking about this topic today. So that said, I'm going to go to the Q&As we've got from the audience. I've got a couple in hand here. And so Paul, the first one is, what are some of the biggest roadblocks you've faced in implementing digital strategies for, and this question says for large companies? I'm going to ask you if you need to nuance that, because our audience, I know, consists of very, very large multi-billion-dollar companies and yet very healthy, profitable, smaller companies than that. So some of the biggest roadblocks you faced in implementing digital strategies for direct selling companies, if you will.
Sure. I think the biggest statement is gain alignment with either your C-suite or your investors or your founder before you start anything, right? Build the business case, put business acumen behind the process. Don't ignore metrics. Don't implement something that you just guess at and basically aren't doing the research ahead of time. I see this time and time again, where often because that stuff's time consuming. It's a lot more time consuming than you realize. But just make sure you've got your data backing up those statements. And I think it's critically important to define those success metrics up front, and then to, in collaboration with whoever you're using, either internally, externally, to measure them frequently and to maintain complete transparency through the program with whoever it is that's funding it. And I think that the biggest statement to then make for big organizations is organizational change management. It becomes exponentially harder the larger the company that you're talking about, and it should never be ignored. And that initiative, whatever it is, should be adequately planning for that to be successful.
Thank you. And I'm going to try to combine two of our questions here. So I've got one that says, what are some ways you'd like to see innovation develop in direct selling? And the other one says, where do you see the industry in 3 to 5 years regarding digital transformation? So I'm going to sort of glom those together. What you'd like to see and where you see the industry being in 3 to 5.
My biggest topic, and it's sort of to some degree, a little bit of I've realized this myself, and it's what I now am doing, is that direct sellers need to embrace the need to modernize their commerce environments, and to take a page out of the playbook that's come from direct-to-consumer companies. I think that it's honestly what I realized, and when I started talking to friends, colleagues around what I wanted to do next, I started to realize there was a pretty urgent need. And to be honest with you, got to the point where I just personally didn't have the bandwidth to take on any more work, but But I now know from looking at it that it's a significant opportunity, but also a big challenge for direct sellers right now. Going back to they've got legacy environments that were custom built. If some of their team disappeared, resigned, they'd have literally no idea how to run their business anymore because it's all behind the scenes, all completely custom. And just to completely pivot that and to move to a platform that's just out of the box the way that it is, like the Shopify's of the world, is a big change management thing to do, and actually changes the way that you even resource your organization. Completely different roles, but much more efficient. And then
go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
And so I think that's where I'm starting to see it, and I'd love to see more of it. I think building on that point, and it's a difficult one to make. It's direct sellers then kind of looking at how the industry's evolving and recognizing the fact that to some degree, the consumer wants to purchase from the manufacturer, and they don't necessarily want to involve anyone in sales, right? So then figuring out how that can then be a good balance in the direct selling world, so that no direct selling rules and regulations are broken, but the consumer is being met where they want to be met.
That's huge. That's huge. So this next one's a very good question. We talked about established companies, young companies, that kind of thing from a technology perspective, but this question talks about the sales force, right? Your older established sellers who have their own processes and systems. What are some suggestions for maximizing success with new tech adoption across all segments of the field? That's a great question.
I think that it goes back to education. So I think regardless of the size of the organization, it's around and I call it organizational change management, but really what it comes down to is it's teaching, educating, making people familiar with what the organization is talking about, how it can improve things, and what benefits that you would get from it.
Final question for you, because we're running out of time here, a couple minutes left. Do you have advice for someone just starting to explore digital technology and direct selling? I'm pretty new to this.
I think that the biggest thing to do that I've experienced myself is just make sure that you have a trusted partner that is very knowledgeable in direct selling as you move forwards with any of these transformation initiatives. Make sure that that they are very familiar with the way that commerce as an environment and all the capabilities that surround it. So, marketing automation, et cetera, have all changed, and ensure that within this, that it's all pulled together so that it can help you make those right decisions. It's just changing so rapidly that it's important to bring in outside advice and not just rely on like a vendor to do that for you.
Well, thank you very much. I personally have greatly enjoyed this conversation. It's been nice getting to know you throughout this process. And we should probably, let's do a commercial for, whoops, sorry, didn't mean to end the slideshow. But on that note, don't forget, we will be, by following up with you, sending you a link to the recording. If you got any questions, there was Paul's LinkedIn that I was trying to get back to earlier in the PowerPoint and couldn't get there. And then you can always reach out to sales@rallyware.com. So thanks so much again for your time today. And we will be letting you know when our next webinar in our series is coming out. Take care, everyone. Have a great day.